So I wanted to make this video because I have a soft spot for the Clutch Claw, and I think that it gets an undeserved amount of hate online, and I wanted to create something that would work as a defense of the Clutch Claw, and so I went and played Iceborne, and that made me change my mind. So the Clutch Claw in 3 words. Clutch Claw bad. End video. So I think that there are 3 main reasons why the Clutch Claw is so bad of reputation. And I think that in short, it's that 1, the Clutch Claw feels bad to use. 2, the Clutch Claw is a disguised nerf. And 3, it reduces the scope of Monster Hunter fights rather than increasing it like it ought to. The tenderizing mechanic, and if you don't know the tenderizing mechanic is, you latch onto the monster's face, you whack him in the eyeball, and then you get a little sort of texture change on the monster's body part that indicates that it'll take an increased amount of damage in that spot. The tenderizing mechanic means that you're incentivized to keep 1 to 2 at most parts of the monster weakened constantly throughout the fight, and that means that you need to re-tenderize the monster, or specifically the monster's body part, every 90 seconds. Technically it's 3 minutes now that they've doubled the duration, more on that later, but we're going to use the 90 seconds as a figure here because that's how the game was played at launch. And it was really annoying. You're basically playing a juggling match. You have to keep spinning some plates, and you have to do it constantly because otherwise you lose your ability to hunt the monster efficiently. I guess one way to put it into perspective, it's a similar reason why people don't always like the Insect Glaive, because that has a similar ticking clock aspect to the weapon itself with the insect buffs. And it honestly, I was actually back in Base World, I was quite the Insect Glaive enjoyer, but Iceborne really, I just couldn't play the weapon because the Clutch Claw combined with all of the insect buffs meant that more often than not you didn't have one of those 2 things active at the same time, and that meant that you were constantly wasting your buff of one or the other, spending the time to gain the other buff. And the Insect Glaive is also a really great segue into the next point about why the tenderizing mechanic sort of annoyed people, because the Insect Glaive was infamous in Iceborne because the tenderizing didn't work. I think, if I remember correctly, the way that the Insect Glaive span, or when your hunter span the Insect Glaive around during the tenderizer animation, the hitbox of the part that would actually tenderize the monster was a bit wonky. And so if the monster's head just wiggled while, he was attacking or doing whatever, it wouldn't connect and it wouldn't count. It didn't help that the Insect Glaive was a light weapon, more on that later, and so you'd end up having to attack the same body part 3 times just to get it to tenderize. And if you think about, you've then got to do it another 3 times in the next 90 seconds to keep it active. Yeah, you can see why people didn't like it. But yeah, the next topic, it was buggy. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. It was buggy. And to be fair, they did improve it. I believe the Insect Glaive bug is fixed now, as of, I think, the Fatalis update. But yeah, there was a fundamental it doesn't work problem. The problem, one of the many problems with the Clutch Claw was that it divided weapons into light and heavy weapons, and that created a huge level of unbalance. If your weapon was light, then you'd Clutch Claw the monster and attack, and it'd do nothing. You'd hop off, and as you hop off, you'd find that there was a slinger pod on the floor. But if you were a heavy weapon, you'd Clutch Claw the monster, and it would tenderize. The light weapons, you'd have to tenderize the monster, or attack the monster 2 times, and that was just unfair, because no matter how many slinger pods you have, that would never make up for being able to tenderize the monster, something you have to do every 90 seconds. 3 minutes later on, but 90 seconds. If you have to do it twice, like, I think the fastest light weapons were probably taking about maybe 5 seconds to clutch claw, or 5 seconds. Well, no, probably like, yeah, I think about 5 seconds to clutch claw onto the monster, click the attack button, tenderize it, and then hop off. And so you're doing 10 seconds to tenderize the monster. That's quite a lot. That's more than 10% of your total buff time. Yeah. And of course, you are also assuming that it goes perfectly. If you mess it up, if something goes wrong, you have to do it again. That's even longer. That's more time lost, basically. And more tedium. I think it's worth pointing out that it's not fun to have to do something twice when, you know, your friend only has to do it once. And so there was a huge imbalance or unbalanced problem between the light weapons and the heavy weapons. Because if you were a light weapon, it sucked. And if you're a heavy weapon, it sucked less. I think to cut the clutch claw some slack, there were a few times where having slinger pods was useful. I think the final boss of Iceborne, or well, the final main Shara, it was useful because you could use the slinger pods to wallbang him and get a load of damage off in the first phase. Debatable because it was the first phase. You didn't really need to worry about it all that much either way. And then the only other thing I can think of off the top of my head is there is a specific swooping animation that Azure Rathalos would do, and if you had a slinger pod that could flinch, then you can hit Azure Rathalos at the right time and he'll land. And in Iceborne, game of flying monsters flying forever, being able to make Azure-Wrath land is a really nice thing to do. But again, you can find those crystal pods that will do the job on the ground in most arenas. In the Elder's Recess, ultimately, you can fight Azure-Rathalos without doing that. I would be interested to know about how many people already knew about keeping Azure-Rathalos on the ground via slinger pods, because I don't think it's a particularly well-known thing. I'd also like to use this point, or this time, to bring up mantles. We're not going to talk about mantles today, but because we're talking about light and heavy weapons and like constantly grappling onto the monster to tenderize monster parts, the light weapons specifically were almost fueled by the Rocksteady and the invincibility mantle, because without them you have to pay attention to when the monsters are attacking, and like you have to avoid clutch clawing at inopportune times. And if you think about, you know, having to wait 30 seconds to apply a clutch claw or apply one of your two tenderizers just because the monster isn't giving you the attacks that you'd prefer, that's really frustrating. So a lot of people used the invincibility and the Rocksteady mantle a lot, sort of an over-centralizing amount, because they were arguably vital to the clutch claw. So we've talked a lot about tenderizing and the joys and the woes of tenderizing, but that's only half of the clutch claw's gimmick. We've got the other half, which is something that the community has very politely called a wallbang. And wallbangs, they're not great. I'll be honest, I think they were my least favourite part of the clutch claw. So I guess, just to give some context then, wallbangs were obviously a new feature in Monster Hunter, not World, but Monster Hunter Iceborne. The way it works is you clutch claw onto the monster's face. You have the opportunity to turn the monster left or right by like slapping the monster with your big nasty claw hand. And then when the monster is lined up and ready to run into a wall, you use some slinger ammo that you've got equipped and basically shoot that at the monster point blank and drive the monster to run forward into a wall. As an addendum, maybe there was a design intent for light weapons to have an easier time wallbanging monsters. Unfortunately, the game's map have been designed in a way that there is always some form of like rubbish slinger ammo, be it stone or like glow moss, everywhere in the map. And so you almost always have access to some slinger ammo, even if it's not the good stuff that the monsters will drop. And because you can use the most basic stuff to wallbang a monster, it doesn't matter. Like it makes the light weapons redundant, because stones are easier to acquire. Anyway, back on topic. The other big problem with the wallbang is it's so powerful. It does I think a really hefty amount of damage. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but I think it was close to like 5% of the monster's total health. At the very least, it was percentage based. So you do a comfortable chunk of damage just hitting the monster on the wall, and that on its own is overpowered. But then the monster falls down on the ground, and you can just like wail on it for another couple seconds. You get like 10 seconds of knockdown. And it deletes monsters' health, and that's bad. It's bad not just because like monster dies quickly, but because you're not playing the game. The only way to make people play the game is to artificially inflate monsters' health, and then you have the problem of you have to use the wallbang, or you've got a monster with a huge amount of health. But yeah, I think the main problem was you can only use them. Well, it wasn't a problem that you could only use them while the monster was unenraged. I think that was pretty fair. But because you could only use them when the monster was unenraged, it created should we call it a negative feedback loop, where if the monster is unenraged, you throw it into a wall, and that makes the monster angry, understandably, and then you get to play the game. And then the monster stops being angry, and you immediately throw it into another wall. It was really good for Agitator, because it meant you could control how angry the monster was. But the problem is that the more control you give the player, the less alive the monsters feel. I think that the real problem, and the thing that I criticize wallbangs the most for, is because they break the immersion. I think it's too much of a game mechanic. One, you can control how the monster's state is. You get a huge knockdown. You can force the monster to be angry, maximizing your Agitator uptime. And that makes me stop looking at the monster as a monster, and instead as like a thing that I can control. But on a similar level, and from a more gameplay feel perspective, Monster Hunter, to me at least, has always been a game of David and Goliath. The monsters have always been big, scary creatures. The hunters have always been smaller and comparatively much weaker, and without the same ability to, just exist. Or not exist, but like exude power. And so you have this David and Goliath feel, like in terms of a matchup. It's you versus a huge dragon. And the wallbang completely reverses that. I think it gives the player too much power over the fight and the matchup, and it creates a sort of like it makes the player feel too much in control, and that doesn't make it feel like Monster Hunter. As a hunter, I should be fighting a big scary thing, and I should feel like I'm on the back foot most of the time, right? The monster is big, it's scary, it's able to choose where it fights, it's able to dictate how difficult the fight gets based on how it feels, if it's angry or not. It doesn't mesh with that idea if I'm able to just sort of go, bada bing, bada boop, into the wall you go. So we've already talked about why the Clutch Claw is bad. I'm now going to put forward a defense. Let's try and defend the Clutch Claw a little bit. So I think the first thing that you can say if someone's like, oh, I don't like the Clutch Claw, the first thing you can say in response to that is, ultimately, the Clutch Claw is optional. Like, if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. You can complete the game without using it. There's nothing that is inherently required about the Clutch Claw, and so if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. Now, I understand that that's not perfect. I think that the big problems with that as an idea is that, one, it's the defining feature of Iceborne, and so a lot of the game is designed around it, and so not using it feels like a bit of a waste, I guess. It's even if you're not using it, it's still there, it's still on your hand, sort of whispering, oh, you can use me to like do a fuck ton of damage to the monster, to do a whole load of damage to the monster, and just having it there can be annoying. And I think from another perspective, there are parts of the Clutch Claw that you can't ignore. Like, even if you opt out of using the Clutch Claw yourself, that doesn't mean that players online won't use the Clutch Claw. Not that that would really matter, I think, but more importantly, it doesn't mean that monsters won't have like the clagger animation that will still interrupt your fight and, you know, constantly remind you that the Clutch Claw is part of the game that you don't want to use, and the claggers will constantly remind you that the Clutch Claw still exists and that it's annoying. However, to go back to the idea that it's optional, anecdotally, I did try not using the Clutch Claw, and it's not, you know, you do lose a little bit of efficiency. You will go from like a 4-minute hunt to a 5-minute hunt. So you will lose a little bit of time. It will make monsters take longer. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. Like, if you don't like it, it's still viable. You just have to build around not using weakness exploit. The next defense of the Clutch Claw is that a lot of it did get fixed. I think one of the problems with the Clutch Claw, specifically when talking about it online, is that everyone who is talking about the Clutch Claw has their opinions formed from when the Clutch Claw was most memorable to them, which is like back when the game had just released, before all the title updates were, you know, finalized. The game was still expanding, and the Clutch Claw was a lot worse then than it is now. A lot of not a lot of weapons. I think the Sword and Shield and the Dual Blades both gained combos that would allow you to use the Clutch Claw via fighting rather than the awkward, like, step back and shoot at the monster. So that's good. The imbalance between heavy and light weapons got fixed via a new decoration, Clutch Claw Boost, that effectively turn your weapon into both, and so light weapons could finally tenderize in a single hit. I can't I can't say that and not also mention that there's a big caveat here. You can only get Clutch Claw Boost as a charm as early as Icepawns, like as soon as you hit Master Rank. And if you don't want to, like, essentially gimp your build by wasting a charm slot on Clutch Claw Boost, then you have to wait until you've beaten Shara and have access to the Guiding Lands, because that's the earliest you can get the decoration for Clutch Claw Boost. And that's, you know, that's problematic in and of itself. Like, sure, it's a little bit fixed, and like, it is fixed because most people play Monster Hunter, like the longest amount of time people spend with Monster Hunter is normally after the story, so you will have access to Clutch Claw Boost. It's just that it'll take you a while to get there. But also, the other huge thing that got fixed was originally the Clutch Claw's tenderizing mechanic only lasted for 90 seconds. And they've increased that all the way up to 3 minutes now. And so a lot of the spinning, you know, like spinning the plates, that's gone away for the most part, because now it's much more likely that you will get a monster into like a clagger state within 3 minutes, so that you effectively have 100% uptime without having to think about what the monster's doing. And that's a lot better than it was before they changed it. But, you know, I think ultimately the issue is all of these changes happened mostly in the final couple of updates, and overwhelmingly most of them happened in the final major update with Fatalis. And so, even though, yeah, the Clutch Claw is great right now, or at least better right now, a lot of, like, personal opinions on the Clutch Claw is centered around how the Clutch Claw was, rather than how it is. So, the last great defense of the Clutch Claw is maybe not really a defense of the Clutch Claw itself, more of a... how do I describe it? The Clutch Claw gets like an undeserved level of hatred. Not that it doesn't deserve a lot of the hatred that it gets, but there's a level of hatred that it gets because of the things that have changed around the Clutch Claw, rather than because of the Clutch Claw itself. And those are things like the hit zone changes and the change to weakness exploit, that sort of thing. And sure, they changed in relation to the Clutch Claw, but I don't think that they're necessarily the Clutch Claw's fault. I think that if the Clutch Claw were to be just picked up out of Iceborne and plonked down in a future game, exactly the way that it is, a lot of these, like, in the shadow of the Clutch Claw issues wouldn't be apparent because we wouldn't notice a difference because the Clutch Claw wouldn't be added halfway through the game. And, you know, I think the the unfortunate reality is that Weakness Exploit is overpowered and it deserves a nerf at some point. Anyway, back on topic, how would I fix the Clutch Claw? So I think the biggest thing or issue I have with the Clutch Claw is that fundamentally it doesn't do what it promises to do. I think the promise of the Clutch Claw is that you can create your own weak point by tenderizing a body part. And that's awesome, and that was really exciting back in the sort of the hype season of Iceborne, because we were still arguing as a community over flinch free, and the idea that I, the Lancer, who was getting stun locked by all the longsworders at the head, even through my flinch 3 decoration, the idea that I would be able to go to, you know, the monster's leg or the monster's tail and make that weak point as good as hitting the head was awesome, because it meant that we could go back to the older style of like all the hunters are on different sides of the monster and, you know, we'd have space from each other. And that was a cool feature. And I also like the idea that, you know, you can create your own weak point because, you know, the monster's head is too difficult to hit because you're a dual blades user and you're fighting Anjanath or something like that. But I think in application, the Clutch Claw and tenderizing a body part is too cumbersome to like consistently do to like all body parts. Like you don't, outside of like a very heavy melee monster fighting a lance user who's counterattacking a lot, you never see a monster like fully tenderized. Just doesn't happen. But what I would do, or rather, and the issue with that is that if you're only going to tenderize one or two spots, then you're going to want to tenderize the best spots, because, you know, that's just how it works. And then that's a problem because of the way that the Clutch Claw works, as in like its mathematical formula. Long story short, even though the formula makes it so that like bad hit zones get increased more by the tenderizer, they never get increased enough to make it worth just tenderizing the best hit zone. Because if you tenderize the best hit zone, you know, it'll get a little bit better, but that little bit better is always going to be much better than any other hit zone that you could have once tenderized. And so, in theory, the Clutch Claw is this amazing tool that lets people like tenderize Rathian's leg so that they can attack that and have some space from every other hunter in multiplayer. But in reality, it's only ever worth tenderizing the monster's head to make the monster's head even more weak than what it was. Yeah, so that's a problem. And I think the way that I would change that is by tweaking the formula so that the best hit zone on the monster would never be improved. So if we look at Rathian, if her best hit zone is her head at 60, then, you know, you can tenderize her wings or her tail, and those are both increased to 60. But if you tenderize her head, the tenderizing mechanic wouldn't improve it. And that way, you stop the Clutch Claw from being this annoying forced on you tool that increases damage that you now have to use to like maximize your damage efficiency. And instead, it becomes a useful bit of your arsenal that if you're playing solo or you're trying to hunt really efficiently, you don't have to use because you're already going to be hitting the monster's head. It's not a problem. But if you're playing multiplayer or you want to break some monster parts because you're farming something specific, all of a sudden the Clutch Claw becomes really useful because now you can go out of your way to tenderize those parts, make them easier to break, and you will do more damage to them. And so the Clutch Claw ends up being a great multiplayer tool without being like a forced tool that we all have to use and have to hate, or don't use and hate because we hate not being as efficient as possible, because that's what players do. They always optimize the fun out of the game. But yeah, I think in short, the Clutch Claw is a really cool idea, but it's poorly executed. If it did what we all envision for it to do, which is allowing you to create new weak spots on the monster in multiplayer to avoid the flinch-free conundrum, or, so that you can break certain parts that are difficult to hit and difficult to, break. I'm personally thinking of Rathian's back. That was quite an annoying one for me. Then the Clutch Claw becomes a really positive tool, and I think people would like it a lot more. To an extent, they've already done this with other, we'll call them gimmicks. Infamously, well, not really infamously, it was never as infamous as the Clutch Claw was, or is. But back in 4 Ultimate Time, a lot of people really didn't like the way that the mounting system worked, because it was quite intrusive. It was very, very powerful. It was very disruptive, because if someone was mounting on the monster and doing the little stabbing minigame, everyone else in the multiplayer hunt wouldn't be able to attack the monster, because if they did, the monster would have a chance to flinch, and that would knock the player off. And so a lot of people were like, well, mounting is really powerful, and we should do it because of that, but it kind of makes the game a little bit miserable. And thankfully, outside of the Insect Glaive, you could, for the most part, ignore mounting if you wanted to, and if you didn't want to be efficient. And that's less of a thing you can do with the Clutch Claw in Iceborne. But the point is, they changed it. In the later games, you no longer got flinched, and you were no longer negatively impacted if you were mounting the monster and someone else ran up to the monster and started attacking it during that time. Instead, them attacking the monster while you were mounting on it would help you in the minigame. And it's just little things like that, just tweaking small things that changes something that is seen as quite negative into something that is seen as positive and, a useful tool. I guess I probably ought to say, just to make it clear, I think that, weapon imbalance stuff, like having light weapons and heavy weapons as part of Clutch Claw's design, is a flaw. I think if I'm honest, I can understand why they did it, because I think if in a parallel universe where Iceborne came out and there was no distinction between heavy or light weapons, the Clutch Claw would feel unfinished. It would be a sort of very bare bones thing that every weapon would have access to and wouldn't really feel part of the weapon because it's not tied in. But I think that the way that they tied them into the weapons by making half the weapons do different things to the other half of the weapons was a mistake. I think the correct way of tying in the Clutch Claw to the weapons would be to make it so that you can't do the weird, I'll grapple you from a distance Clutch Claw part, and instead, to grapple onto the monster, you have to do a specific combo. I think you'll have to forgive me for not remembering the name of the combo, but the Dual Blades way of grappling onto the monster is really, really nice. I think it's really fun. I think it's cool to do. And if that was the way that all weapons did it, I think that the Clutch Claw would be really interesting. But it's not, so here we are. So to round us off nicely and bring us back to current Monster Hunter topics with Monster Hunter Wilds, obviously it's super early days. We've got the trailer on Friday coming out. We don't have a lot of information about Monster Hunter Wilds at the moment, but the little, and I really do mean little, translated from the Japanese version of the website, because the English version wasn't as accurate or as specific, I guess. Information that we do have does seem to lead us to have the Clutch Claw returning in spirit, if not in form, and I think that's good. From what I've read about and seen discussed online, it seems like the road that the devs are going down is making the Clutch Claw aspect as seamless as possible. It seems like as long as you're in focus mode, you're just going to be naturally building, tenderizing spots on the monster as you hit the monster. Obviously, we don't know how focus mode works. It might be tied to some sort of slinger ammo or like resource that you have to pick up and then activate. It might be a time limit, a time gated thing, like you'd have to build up a meter to like activate focus mode. I'm really excited to see all the like endemic life, and I'm really positive that the game seems to be going down or doubling down on World's sort of immersive ecosystem vibes, because I think that's where Monster Hunter has excelled. I think the best parts of Monster Hunter has always been its sort of like living ecosystem video game. So that's really exciting. Yeah, looking forward to the new trailer. Either way, hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and all that jazz. And I'll see you next time. Thing? Yeah. Every chance that no one fucking knows. God, there's every chance that like we've all been sleeping on the fact that like you can permanently knock Kushala down or something by like slinger podding him at the right time. That would be funny, wouldn't it? Like years of complaining about Kushala Daora never sitting the fuck down, and it turns out it was our fault all along.